Hajime, welcome back to Comic-Jutsu. JT McRoberts here, and today we are going to do our best to answer the question, what is Comic-Jutsu? Well, it all starts with superhero comics, and perhaps my favorite growing up was originally Spider-Man. I was fortunate enough to be able to read the original Marvel books at the local library. They had those digest-sized Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Doctor Strange collections that collected like the first, across several volumes, they collected the first maybe 12 issues of those good old comics. So my first real dose of superhero comics away from the television set and cartoon shows like The Amazing Spider-Man, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, The Incredible Hulk, so on and so forth. So with Spider-Man being such an iconic and flagship character for Marvel, it was just a good gateway over into superhero comics. At one time, exclusively the purview of boys, action comics for boys was essentially what they were considered. So in trying to figure out what lens I could use to talk about comics, I came up with Comic-Jutsu, because everybody loves a good fight scene. I know I do. And we especially love to see fights between impossible and improbable characters that are super fast, super strong, or super skilled. If you allow me to get somewhat pretentious, I'll say that Comic-Jutsu is the exploration of the martial in the art of comics. Comics being the colloquial term for sequential illustration, however one collects them and appreciates them, whether it's in a trade paperback or perhaps a good old single floppy, like this reprint of the original Captain America comics, where he appears to be throwing an overhand right at Hitler. So that's an example where we'll try to break down the actual technique on display. Comic-Jutsu is very much a state of mind, not a state of being, but a state of doing. The best artists always brought their life experience into their art, and it seems to show. Now, of course, all of this is in my opinion, but I'm not going to spend this whole video saying in my opinion over and over and over again. But I am going to show you some examples as we move through time. For Zeta, guys that they either were just directly involved in heavy, hard life experiences, whether it was being, sent off to war, like Kirby and his contemporaries, or a guy like Frazetta who was just a very active individual. I mean, you could find photos and, well, just photos, I suppose, of him. I was going to say videos, but there's not so much video from back in the day. There is a great documentary about Frank Frazetta, which everybody should check out. What was it called? Painting with Fire or something like that. Just see what a rugged, adventurous individual he was. There are pictures of him without a shirt on, riding on a horse. It seemed like he was into boxing and other things like that. So his figures always had a certain weight and a certain truth to them. And we know that, of course, Jack Kirby had his rough and tumble upbringing in the streets of New York, and he also went off to war during World War II. And he brought that experience to his art. Now, I don't know if Robert E. Howard ever did such a thing, but a lot of the artists that came behind him, such as John Buscema and whatnot, definitely imbued their art with a lot of weight and a lot of impact. It's very lived in. I don't know too much about Buscema, but I believe Neil Adams had some kind of training. He's his Batman stories were just so dynamic, and the action scenes were very impactful. And what I found from my appreciation of these particular types of stories and just the action within the comics themselves is that when you learn a little bit about some of the creators, some of them do have experience in various martial arts, or at least one martial art or something to that effect. Whether it's just something simple like boxing or wrestling, or in the case of Jim Starlin, co-creator of Shang-Chi, master of Kung Fu, I believe Jim Starlin had some experience in judo. So you see a bit of that on play in the story itself. Iron Fist. I wonder about Mike Zeck. Mike Zeck in the late 70s, early 80s to mid 80s was just a cottage industry of action covers. Anything that had his artwork on the cover was an instant buy for me, whether it was Captain America, G.I. Joe, Master of Kung Fu, what have you. Manhunter, an interesting one. Gil Kane had some fantastic dynamic action scenes as well. I wish I'd have asked him about his background in it. Gil Kane was one of the great masters that I did get to meet and listen to him speak at the local convention, at Heroes Convention in Charlotte. And actually, I used the bathroom next to him. That's my story. Is that I was at one urinal and Gil Kane was at the next one, and we had no interaction whatsoever. I handled my business, he handled his. I turned around, washed my hands, and walked out. He kind of looked at me as he walked over to wash his hands. I nodded and walked out. That's, I suppose that was the most positive experience I could have with him. I just did not want to bother the man while he was in the bathroom. The stories of Alan Moore being hounded by fans at Comic-Con, were just reverberating in my head, I suppose. Hands of the Dragon, not necessarily a great one, but perhaps we'll look at some of the lesser known and less successful works along the way, but we'll always get back to the good stuff. And we're not just talking about your basic human capabilities. I mean, we're going to mix in superhuman fighting as well and talk about how it might intermingle with normal humans. Though here in the case of Cap, we have the extraordinary human. Here we have more superhuman levels at play. Though Juggernaut is one of those guys that's close to God tier strength, if you will. Nice boxing stance right there on the cover. But I am going to challenge myself by branching out, for example, to Lone Wolf and Cub. There's a nice Frank Miller cover. That might include some sword play, or perhaps ninjutsu. You can't have ninjas without a Wolverine in there somewhere. The X-Men were another early touchstone for me. I suppose my very first experience with all of them had to have been through The Amazing Spider-Man. And those episodes where they had the X-Men on there were just some of my absolute favorites. G.I. Joe was an early influence before that, because the action figures were everywhere. And the coolest one was, without a doubt, Snake Eyes. And then eventually Storm Shadow. Destro was pretty cool too. You'll see Frank Miller pop up again and again and again. Though in my research, I've only seen him mention actually studying Tai Chi at the time, which out of all the martial arts to study, I mean, that's I suppose a good one for, unity of body and mind, but not the one that I would put on the list of styles for, let's say, potential mixed martial arts fighters. Okay, sometimes I'm going to apologize in advance for what you're about to see, but sometimes some of my books are in a little bit less than optimal quality, like this one, for example. This was a third printing of the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right there. And it got banged up when it was stored. I did not realize that. And for a long time, I just didn't have bags and boards for a lot of my books for whatever reason. Now, here's a favorite of mine for a superhuman god tier battle. One of the best. And its sequel, Miracle Man 15. But when we need to get back down to the human range, there are things like Vigilante, or more Mike Zeck work in The Punisher. That was definitely a favorite issue where the Punisher goes to jail. Neil Adams pops up again with his own creator-owned work with Armor and Samurai, which I remember seeing these on the spinner racks. And this Samurai is one that I bought off the spinner racks at Walden's Books, back when they had Walden's Books, and when Walden's Books had spinner racks, and they had a whole gaming section and a sci-fi section, and you'd see all those things intermingled. Or perhaps The Badger by the one and only Mike Baron. Frank Miller will pop up again and again and again. But then so will other forms of perhaps not so martial combat, such as professional wrestling. Here you see the rare Warrior #1, the Ultimate Warrior comic book. So if you're a little warrior and a believer, we'll have something to talk about at one point. Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee, written by Mike Baron. I actually did ask Mike Baron about his training. We'll go into that when we get to those issues. More Master of Kung Fu. Of course, you can't have Kung Fu without the immortal Iron Fist. And here we have the absolute classic run by Brubaker and Matt Fraction and Alexander Aja. Is it Aja or Aja or Asia? I've heard it so many different ways. Powerman Iron Fist. Iron Fist. Jim Starlin returns with his creator-owned works. Breed. Definitely love that one. Frank Miller, yet again, making another appearance. This time with Year One. The interior illustrated by none other than John Romita Jr., though. And he's one that I'm curious about because I don't know if his just come from just pure experience drawing, but he's got to have some kind of experience because all of his figures, they look so believable, whether they're running, jumping, punching, swinging, crouching, flying, falling. They're just phenomenal. Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings. These last few, perhaps not so much truth to them, but then others have even more truth. And we shall see. We'll see where it leads. Along the way, we might talk about a little bit of philosophy or technique, or maybe history, or maybe the particular styles of the time. Maybe we'll mention a few of their secrets. So that is basically what Comic-Jutsu is all about.